Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Welcome to Prog Chattery 777. We are talking about Rush. We've made it to their third album, released in 1975. This is Caress of Steel. I could have swore I had this album on vinyl, but I cannot for the life of me find it, so the CD jewel case will have to do for the purposes of the video. That's okay. But yeah, Caress of Steel, very interesting album. Like I said, it's their third album, released in 75, and it's a very important stepping stone for the band. It's also, a real statement of intent. This is the first time where we see Rush, really living up to their prog rock ambitions and trying to create something, along the same lines of Yes or Genesis. Of course, the previous album, Fly By Night, we're introduced to Neil Peart on drums and lyrics, and what a difference he made on that record. But Fly By Night is still, largely in that kind of heavy blues rock mindset. A lot of the tracks still have that vibe, but Fly By Night shows them experimenting and kind of flirting with the prog thing. There's a couple more acoustical flavors on Fly By Night, as well as their first ever epic, By Tor and the Snow Dog. So I've always seen Fly By Night as essentially a hard rock album that flirts with progressive rock. This feels more like a proper prog rock album. There's a lot of great moments on Caress of Steel, but it's still a little patchy to me. It's an almost but not quite album. They dove into the prog thing really quite quickly. I mean, when you compare Fly By Night to Caress of Steel, their ambition level just goes right through the roof by the time they get to this. Which is great, and that's why I consider this album, a stepping stone. Even, if you compare it to 2112, or you compare it to, Farewell to Kings, or Hemispheres, or, Moving Pictures, or any of those, it's always going to fall short. But Rush had to do this to get to the point where they were able to produce those, those other records down the road. So, I mean, it's a very, very interesting historical document, and there are really, really good songs on here. There's one track on here that I consider probably the best of that early period of Rush. Of course, notably, like I said, they're doing the prog rock thing, so there's two big epics on this album. There's one 12-minute epic split into three parts, and the second epic takes up the entire second side of the record. They did the full side-long 20-minute suite thing, and again, both those epics are patchy, and there's moments where you can really hear, oh, that's Rush. That is so Rush. A definitive Rush sound comes up in all bits and pieces all across this album. But the epics are still a bit, bitty. It still feels like they're just, kind of, okay, we've made it this far, let's write another random piece of music and then just clunk it on there. It's not as well-rounded as some of the stuff that they were to do later on. But like that said, it still is a good album. It's just when compared to their great albums, you can see its flaws, and there's a bit of patchiness to it. I think they really rushed recording this album too. I think that may have to do with some of the patchiness. They're a very young band, like I said, obviously totally full of ambitions, and trying to write a 20-minute piece of music within a couple of weeks. The time crunch and the pressure, ultimately meant that they probably weren't able to fine-tune it as well as they may have liked. But like I said, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because it does serve its purpose. It's a stepping stone. It's the album that took them from being a hard blues, a heavy blues band to being a prog band. This is the album where they make that jump. And as such, it's very, very interesting. Lyrically, we see Neil Peart going straight down into the fantasy realm, which I'm a fan of some of it. Some of it I'm not quite as big a fan of. You gotta have the taste for those sci-fi lyrics, and they're not sci-fi. They were more fantasy here. Sci-fi came in the next album. But the fantasy thing, again, you gotta have the taste for it, and it's not always been my taste. But the playing is great, and that's a really notable thing with this album too. As I said in the previous videos, Rush has always been about chops, even way back in the John Rutsey days. They're expert players. And with Fly By Night, they got a little less shy and they're starting to show it off a little bit. And this album is, there's a lot of snippets of really, really tremendous playing, and those are the moments on the album that are very, very definitively Rush, where you say, oh, that's the Rush thing, that's the Rush sound right there. So it's all quite good and interesting. And I obviously probably didn't need to mention, if you're watching the videos, you know that Rush is Geddy Lee on bass and vocals, Alex Lifeson on guitar, and Neil Peart on drums and lyrics. I'm probably not going to introduce them every single time with these Rush videos, because if you're watching the video, I'm pretty sure you're a fan and you're going to know who's in the band. But yeah, anyway, let's dissect the tracks of this curious beast, shall we? So the album opens with Bastille Day. Now this is the one that I mentioned that I think is this is probably the best Rush song in that pre-2112 period. Bastille Day, definitely the best song on the album for me. It is a high energy rock number, but it's got all the proggy arrangements in there, and it's probably one of the heaviest prog songs that were around at the time, excluding things like Lark's Tongues and Aspic and anything King Crimson were doing. But King Crimson is an exceptional beast, and it's kind of in its own little world. But Bastille Day is a really, really good track. Opens the album beautifully. Love that guitar riff that opens it up. Really, really sets the stage, and it's just classic Rush. It's got that high energy, but there's also the tricky arrangements to it. And I always used to say, oh, Bastille Day is the obvious follow-up to Anthem, which opened up Fly By Night. But I think I like Bastille Day more than Anthem, because you can see them playing with the arrangement a lot more. And even though it does kind of go off into, there's a few different passages it sneaks off into, it still maintains that tight structure. It's still a well composed, tight, heavy rock song with cool arrangements, and it still takes you on a little bit of a journey. I particularly like towards the end where they have that, there's that kind of driving rock song, their driving rock rhythm, and then they syncopate it. That's really cool. And then of course it's got the big finish where it reprises the main melody of the chorus with the guitar, and really, really great stuff. I love hearing that tight playing really coming to the fore, and they've really defined themselves with that track, I think. And lyrically, it's probably my favorite set of lyrics on the album, actually. What's better than a rock song about the French Revolution? That's fantastic. So yeah, Bastille Day, best song on the album, and one of the best early Rush songs, I think. Moving on to track 2, I Think I'm Going Bald. Kind of a fun little number, really. It might be seen as a bit throwaway. Very much in the hard blues thing that they had established on the first record. I mean, I Think I'm Going Bald could fit quite comfortably on that first record, I think. But it's cool that they throw that in there. You go from the sort of highbrow lyric about the French Revolution and a history lesson to a very silly, not too serious song about going bald. Ultimately, it's a bit forgettable. It's just kind of blues riff, and they chug away on it. Probably it was put there just to keep fans of the really early days on board. Oh yeah, they can still do the blues rock thing or whatever. According to Wikipedia, the song was written for Kim Mitchell, who was another Canadian artist at the time in a band called Max Webster, which I might do videos on. Probably won't get a lot of views because Max Webster didn't go too far to Canada, but I'll save the Max Webster talk for another time. Yeah, so I Think I'm Going Bald. Probably the weakest on the album. Almost certainly the weakest on the album. Not that it's bad, it's just the other stuff's better. Track 3, we got Lakeside Park. Now this was definitely a pretty big hit for them, at least in Canada. I'm not sure how big this song is outside of Canada, but it is very popular around this area because, of course, Lakeside Park is referring to a specific park in a little town called Port Dalhousie in St. Catharines, Ontario. And it's a nice little track. The lyrics make reference to the May 2-4 weekend. So because of course Canada's a Commonwealth country, we celebrate Queen Victoria's birthday by partying. And Lakeside Park is it's a nice little. The lyrics are a nice little reference to weekends, long weekends out by the lake, which is quite nice. Rush isn't a big fan of this song, funnily enough. I think I've got nothing wrong with it. A little more laid back, you know. It is a rock song, but it's kind of got the more laid back riff, which is quite nice. And it's got like a nice little bridge, you know. It's a well written little piece. It's funny because Rush said they weren't quite as big a fan of Lakeside Park, and yet they did bring Lakeside Park back into the set for the final tour, which I thought was really, really cool. But yeah, you know, it's not the best on the album. Certainly nothing compared to Bastille Day. Then we move on to track 4. Now this is the first of the epics, and this is where we see Rush diving into the prog thing wholeheartedly. We get the Necromancer. 12 minutes long, split into 3 parts. I don't think it's quite as good as Bytor and the Snow Dog from the previous album. Bytor, you know, even though it is split into 4 or 5 different sections or something, you know, the song holds together really, really well. It is one single composition. Problem I have with the Necromancer is, you know, it is one composition. You know, the songs are all linked together, but the bits are so distinct from one another that, you know, it's not quite as coherent. It also has the narrator's voice. You know, 3 travelers, men of Willowdale. Willowdale's a suburb of Toronto, in case you didn't know. I was never quite sold on the whole narration thing. You know, I think that. This is, you know, right in the midst of the fantasy lyric obsession, very heavily influenced by Tolkien and stuff like that, and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, that sort of thing. But yeah, as a whole, it doesn't really work too well for me. But the first 2 parts I think are really, really cool. The first part, Into the Darkness. Very, very Floydian. We can hear definite Pink Floyd influence. Just the way those gentle, atmospheric guitar chords are strummed by Mr. Lifeson. Really, really, really nice. And that's the problem with the narration, is every time the narrator comes up and speaks, it becomes very obvious, okay, we're switching to the second part of the song, which is musically almost totally different, but they use the narrator to link all the parts up. But the second part, Under the Shadow, is probably my favorite part of the Necromancer, and one of the highlights on the album. This is we really get to see that playing come in. Big heavy riff, boom, doom, da da, down, doom, da da. Great, epic vocals by Geddy. You know, his voice just soars over that heavy riff, and then it goes into the jam session, and that little jam is one of the highlights on the album for me. Such a great bass line. Boom, doom, 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 doom. Such a good groove, and it's getting more and more removed from that blues rock thing. It's getting more into just a general sort of, it's a heavy proggy jam sort of thing, and great guitar solo on top of that, and again, phenomenal drumming on the case of Pert. So that's really cool. And then we get to the third part of the Necromancer, Return of the Prince, which is, I think, making reference to the prince that's in Bytor and the Snow Dog. So the epics are all kind of connected that way, which is kind of cool, the linking their albums together. Return of the Prince I like a little bit less. You know, it's got the big happy riff, which is cool, but it doesn't quite live up to Into the Darkness or Into the Shadow, the first 2 parts of Necromancer. So yeah, it is good. You know, it's got lots of highlight moments to it, but it's not really, it's not as cohesive as Bytor. And the one song that I kind of compare it to, the Necromancer, reminds me a little bit of Natural Science from Free Will, and Natural Science is one of the best epics they ever did, in my opinion. So yeah, even though there is kind of a similar structure there, Natural Science will always be far superior. But yeah, it's definitely not bad. Not bad. It shows their lofty ambitions, which is really cool. Then we finally get to track 5, so we flip the record over, or the CD over. We don't actually flip CDs over, obviously. But track 5, the sidelong 20-minute suite, is the Fountain of Lamneth. And again, what an ambitious thing to do, to go ahead and attempt that. Like I said, on the whole, Fountain of Lamneth probably suffers from the same stuff that the Necromancer suffers from, but a little bit more. It does feel like there's a lot of padding, like they're deliberately throwing stuff in so that the thing would extend all the way across the entire second side of the album. So there's certain arrangement choices that I don't think are totally great, and some of the song sections don't really fit with the rest of the piece. But again, like the Necromancer, there's sections of Fountain of Lamneth that are just so good, and you really hear that definitive Rush thing coming out, and it's exciting. That's why it's this is a very interesting historical document and a very good historical document. But like I said, there's certain arrangement issues that I have a problem with. My biggest problem with the Fountain of Lamneth is how, obviously there's the different sections that make up the whole song, but there's a few cases where the changeover is just so jarring. I can't think of what section. I can't think of what section specifically, but there's a few times where the music just stops and then there's silence for a few seconds and then it just starts up again. I think Rush is a band that would later develop a great skill for making those links and creating musical links to go from one passage to another. The most frustrating part of Fountain of Lamneth is right towards the grand finale. What is it? It's either Panacea or Bacchus Plateua. I can't remember which one it is, but the song's just grooving and it just fades out. And then the main riff comes back in again, and it makes it feel so disjointed and disconnected. But not to be overly critical, I mean, like I said, there's some really, really, really great stuff on Fountain of Lamneth. We'll try and go through it as best we can. It opens with a nice little acoustic piece, probably the lightest thing they've done, aside from Rivendell. Rivendell on Fly By Night's very, very light. Very Yes to start out with a nice little, folky acoustic piece, and it works its way into the main riff, which is really, really good. That's one of those great highlight moments. Really, again, it's an early Rush highlight moment. It's not as good as some of the stuff that was to come later, but one of those moments on the album where you throw it on, and if you're not familiar with this album, I think there's a lot of Rush fans that start at 2112 and go from there, and then this is almost like prehistory. But it surprises you how good and how intact sections of this are. They must have really been listening to Genesis, because that main riff to Fountain of Lamneth really reminds me of Water of the Skies, compared to there's definitely a correlation there. I think even Alex Lifeson mentioned that he was really, really into Steve Hackett at the time, so that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, like I said, that main theme is one of the strongest parts of the Fountain of Lamneth, and it has its own little verse and chorus and whatnot. It's all quite good and very, very well performed, very intricate stuff. And again, like you're seeing that the technical virtuosity factor is starting to shine through more and more. The next bit, Didacts and Narpets, Narpets is an anagram for parents. It's about teachers and parents. It's basically just a drum solo with Getty yelling things on top, which is kind of avant-garde and weird and cool. Almost reminds me of Thick as a Brick. Thick as a Brick has that kind of random section where there's just madness going on. So that's cool. No One at the Bridge, the next section. This is where it starts to feel a little bit disconnected from the rest of the track, but it is good. It is a good sort of mellow track. Then we get to Panacea, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. This gets really, really mellow, almost a little bit sleepy. It seems so far removed from the stuff at the beginning of the track that if you're not paying attention, you can lose interest really quick. So that might be a bit of a weak end. We get to the next part, Bacchus Plateua, and it starts to pick up again. And again, you can almost picture this really cool transition where they'd be able to switch back into that main riff, and they choose not to do that. The fifth part just fades out, and then the reprise of the main riff comes back for the last part, which is the fountain. It all winds its way back into a little gentle acoustic part at the very beginning, so that's nice. You've got the same acoustic part at the beginning and the very end. And then the very last thing we hear on the album, of course, is Peart on the cymbal, and there's this little whoosh, little whoosh of neat atmosphere to close the album out. So that's it. Like I said, it's a patchy album. It's far from perfect, but it's an important stepping stone. Rush needed to do Caress of Steel in order to do 2112, in order to do Hemispheres, in order to do Moving Pictures, and all those great classics. Wouldn't have been possible if they didn't pool their resources together as ambitious young men and put together what they hoped would be a big prog album. I think they were very proud of the album at the time, because, who wouldn't? We just went from being a blues band to Genesis. They weren't quite as good as Genesis at this point, or yes. They still rocked harder. They still had that harder, heavier edge, but, this is part of their apprenticeship. They're still working towards the greatness that they would eventually reach. But yeah, like I said, they were very, very proud of this album, and the album was a commercial flop, and the tour was a disaster. They called it the Down the Tubes tour, and it became a situation of do or die for Rush. So it's a critical moment in their career too, the months following this. But everything turned out all right in the end, even though they had increasing record company pressure to change their sound and go back to making the more commercial sounds. You got to make simpler songs, hard rock songs again. They were under immense pressure to do that, and with their next album, 2112, they did not bow to the record company, and they created something very special, which I will talk about next time. Until then, thank you very much for watching my near incoherent, unedited ramblings on Rush, Caress of Steel. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe and all that fun stuff, and stay tuned in the future for more Rush chats. 2112 is next. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you later.